Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and students, welcome to this lecture, which is not only the 7th lecture of the Space Lecture series on the role of the European Union in fostering a European space ecosystem, but also the 5th lecture of our high-level Transatlantic Lecture series, launched this spring by the American Europe Fund and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. My name is Giulia Pavesi, and I'm pleased to serve as moderator for today's discussion. Today's lecture will focus on the European Union and the United States foreign policy approaches to space policy. Before we dive into today's topic, however, allow me to briefly say a few words about the new American Europe Fund at KU Leuven, which is coordinated by the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. The fund was established to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of, but also stronger mutual relations between the US and the EU, including Belgium, which is the home of the European institutions and NATO. To this end, the fund promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research at KU Leuven aimed to strengthen comparative knowledge of American and European societies. Within this context, the Transatlantic Lecture Series is designed as a dialogue between a distinguished American and a European speaker to gain an understanding of the perspectives of both sides on important challenges and to understand where there is a common ground and when there are perspectives which may differ. The lecture series is called The United States and the European Union, a New Momentum, and it's meant to explore whether the new administration in the United States presents an opportunity to renew the transatlantic relationship. As regards to today's lecture, although sharing many mutual goals and policies, the United States and Europe approach to decision-making is very different. And this, of course, reflects their respective differences in organization, government, economic and legal frameworks. However, the effective management of outer space is a global responsibility that transcends nations and regions. As the management of outer space is a relatively small segment of national activities, but is now intricately entwined in almost all international issues. Finding a path for nations and economies to cooperate but also to compete in space is an ongoing challenge, even for nations with long histories of engagement and agreements. Therefore, this talk will highlight major issues with regard to space in the United States and Europe, looking towards the growth and sustainability of both governments and private entities in future space endeavors. And on that note, I'm very pleased to present our distinguished speaker. Professor Henry Hertzfeld is the co-director of the Space Policy Institute and research professor of space policy and international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He is also adjunct professor of law at George Washington University and is an expert in the legal, economic, and policy issues of space and advanced technological development. Dr. Hertzfeld has also served as a senior economist and policy analyst at both NASA and the National Science Foundation, and is a consultant to both the US and international agencies and organizations. At this point, I would like to call all the participants to submit any question that they might have to our distinguished speaker via the question box that you can find on the right side of your screen. We will be collecting all those questions and they will be posed to our guests at the end of during the Q&A. And now, without further ado, I have the honor to leave the floor to Professor Henry Hertzfeld.
Thank you, Julia, for that very nice introduction. Good afternoon. You'll note that the topic, as I was asked to speak about, was cooperation or competition. And I just wanted to make it clear that it really is competition or cooperation and competition. It's not a binary either or situation, because in order to really compete, cooperate, you must be able to compete. You must bring something to the table of value, that's of value for each side in order to really develop an equal relationship in a cooperative effort. If not, you have foreign aid. But we are talking about transatlantic cooperation where both the United States and European countries or the EU have competencies and different things, different specialties to bring to the table. Both can benefit greatly from cooperation, but also the ability to cooperate is extremely important to both. Next slide, please. Now, we're looking at space policy, and really it is divided and fragmented in both the United States and Europe in some ways, but they're different ways. Of course, the United States is one government and one entity. Europe is a combination of 27 nations. You have organizations like ESA, which has, I believe, 22 nations, some of them not even in the EU, and the EU has another set, and you have a very splintered national situation in Europe, because nations are important in space policy, just as international organizations are as well. So in Europe, you have research programs that some of which are in the traditional area in the European Space Agency, but for many years the EU has sponsored a framework of research as well, more basic research in some cases, but it has a space component. Originally, I believe, more in remote sensing and Earth observation types of programs, but now in all types of scientific and engineering areas. And regulation, though, is again split between some things at the European level and some at the national level. But nations, we must remember, are the signatories of the treaties on space and have obligations within their own national laws to carry out those obligations. International organizations do accede to the and agree to abide by many of the UN treaties on space, but they are not states parties to the treaties. The United States is fragmented in a different way because we've grown up with a number of different types of organizations. First of all, the overall government is divided, as most of you know, into the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. That's in our Constitution. And the executive office of the president has varied, as you'll see in the next chart in a minute, in terms of where and how space is dealt with. But we have a number of agencies, NASA, Defense Department, Commerce Department, the Interior Department, and so on, that deal with space, not so much in a regulatory area, but certainly in a policy area, and particularly in policies within their domains. The regulatory part of the United States approach is also includes one major agency, the Federal Communications Commission, which does not report to the executive directly, reports to Congress, but the commissioners are appointed by the president and approved with Senate approval. So there's a combination there that's a bit unique. And that doesn't mean the FCC doesn't work well with the other agencies. They do, and they all cooperate. And we have interagency panels and reviews of many things that are in the regulatory environment. But the reporting lines are a little bit different. Congress itself has many committees, as you all know, well know, I hope, in the Senate and the House of Representatives that deal with space. They hold hearings, they pass various laws, even some often incorporate space policies that originated in the executive office. And sometimes Congress will do its own thing, and of course has control over authorization and allocation of the budgets and money from the bills that have been passed. Next slide, please. But also with the recent change in administration, I'll have some comments about space policy and what we can expect as we move ahead later on in this presentation. But note that all prior space policies, executive orders, and congressional actions, legislative actions, and the space policy directives that were issued over the last 4 years remain in place until changed. That was true with the past administration, from the Trump administration from Biden. It's true with the Biden administration now. So what's there stays there until it's acted upon. Congress may make some changes and pass different legislative bills this year. They, as you know, the makeup of Congress politically has changed in that the Senate is now Democratic controlled. The House of Representatives actually is a little more balanced, still is Democratic controlled, so that we can expect to see changes there as we move ahead. But it takes time. The budgets are still being developed from this in this new administration, but we'll see the policy shifts there. And a budget, as you know, is a planning document, but it is also very much a policy document. Next slide, please. This is a chart developed a while ago by Professor Pace, who was head of the executive director more recently of the National Space Council. And it shows how different the executive looks at space over time. This goes way back to the Eisenhower administration on the left-hand side, and reflects the very high importance of the National Security Advisor, and then in the National Aeronautics and Space Council, reporting to the Vice President, to Johnson, Vice President Johnson, and they became president later. And they were very much involved, and that was where the organization of the Apollo program occurred, and it was at a very high visibility. But after the Apollo program, we had most of the space policy relegated at a slightly lower level in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Security Council, and the OMB, Office of Management and Budget staff in the White House. It didn't have as much visibility or as much interest to the Vice President then. In the Republican administrations, in particular Reagan and Bush, it was then again elevated into a National Space Council at a high level. Once again, I won't say demoted, but put back in the Office of Technology Policy and National Security Council staff in the Clinton era. And but note there that Vice President Gore in that era was very much interested, of course, in environmental policy, and took an interest in space, even though the official lines show that this was at a lower level. And of course, in more recent years, we've had a National Space Council, and that will the administration has said will continue in the future, I suspect, and it is an amalgamation of different agencies meeting at a high level, usually with the Vice President in charge. As I've said, and this we'll say in a later slide, to date, we don't know how involved Vice President Harris will be in space affairs. There's been no announcement yet, but I'll have more to say about that later. Anyway, next slide, please. The organization in Europe of space situations, space policy, is also very confusing, and it's a complex organization. There are changing priorities over time, both the United States and Europe. But the important thing is no one person or office can handle all space issues. They really extend over many different areas. And in the United States, as we mentioned, we have 5 or 6 agencies that are heavily involved in regulation. You know, if you were to sit down today and try to design a good governmental organization for handling space affairs, I think we do it quite differently than we have now in the United States. But we've had this now for 50 years. It's entrenched not only in the agencies, but in personnel, in relationships with other agencies, and in industry and industry organizations, lobbying, all of that. So that I don't think it's that the organization is really going to change. There was an effort in the last administration to consolidate, to have one approach, one overall national approach, and to some extent that was successful in the White House. Nonetheless, each agency is still responsible for its own affairs. And we'll see how all of the proposals that were oriented toward bringing policy together, those will probably stay, but how they are looked at and how they are dealt with in a new administration with new people in charge is yet to be developed and yet to be known. All that being said, overall policy has been pretty stable in space affairs. Number one, it's a very technical organization, subject. As you know, you have to know something about engineering and physics and chemistry and science and research and how to put all of these things together to be successful in space, so that the experts don't change over time. These people who actually have to function and do and perform are not political. And many of these many space projects as well extend over many, many years. And so that there's a natural stability, a natural progression, and radical changes are very rare in space policy. Even when they are tried, the Obama administration, for example, didn't want to continue with the Bush administration's focus on the moon. So that, well, we'll send astronauts to asteroids in space. And it fairly quickly became clear that that was not a feasible alternative. We're back to the moon in the Trump administration. We're staying there now, and we're still on that course, which has really been the long-term trend anyway over time. Next slide, please. Money is important. So how much money is being spent? Let's compare the United States and Europe. US and government programs alone, I estimate between 40 and 50 billion dollars a year is put into space. Sounds like a lot. It is. It's a small proportion of the federal budget. It's a small proportion of the gross domestic product. Nonetheless, it's still a lot of money. The wide range is because, as you can imagine, there are a number of DoD and intelligence community programs where actual numbers are not published. So I'm giving a broad range there. But we do know that NASA, that will be in the next chart, but when we get to it, budget is just under 25 billion estimated for next year if Congress approves that. But it's been about, that's some growth from the approximately 22 billion this year. Private investment, depends how you measure it. You'll see numbers in the United States as much as 15 billion per year. I think that's, it's growing fast. I think that may be a high number, but what's changed and changes almost from year to year is the type of investor, whether we have the angel investors, the billionaires in space. That's quite a bit of that proportion, by the way, that number, by the way. By the type of investment, what I mean there is estimate I've seen is about a third of it may be going into launch vehicles, some of it into mergers and acquisitions, which is not, it's an investment, but it is really an investment that's measured by expected future earnings of firms, not necessarily by the money actually put in each year. And the types of investments vary from, as you know, initial public offerings to venture capital and to loans by banks and other equity investments. And as I said, that distribution has moved around in the numbers year to year. In Europe, I'm estimating the total approximately of government spending, that's the European Space Agency, the EU programs, and national programs, probably a little less than $10 billion. And these are just very large estimates, not specifics, and it's growing in the private sector too. But note that that it's in the government spending, it's about 25% of the US. It's quite small. Small percentage, and also in the private sector, it's even smaller. We have to look at that more carefully as we move along. That 200 million was an estimate several years ago. It could be larger now. Next slide, please. I think this is a very important chart. Government priorities. From day one in the United States, space had to do with national security. It's well documented that the Apollo program was a massive infusion of money over 10 years in the 1960s, and it was oriented primarily to showing the world we had better technology than the Soviet Union, period. Now, economic realities, economic projections, the fact that when we spend that much money, Congress and everybody knows that jobs are going to be created, income will be created, it will be a leverage for economic growth. But that was not the major purpose of the expenditures. In Europe, we see that and frankly, as a footnote, in many developing nations as well, the important spending is to stimulate jobs and growth. It's the economy first, and national security second. And so it reflects the amounts of money from the prior chart. And the next, please go to the next chart. And just to add to that, national security policy in almost every aspect of as viewed by the US government outranks everything else. Economic, even overall fiscal and monetary policy involves national security, but in focusing on national security, economic impacts may sometimes be overlooked. Commercial space policy is not the driver of space security and national security in the United States. It is large, it is being incentivized, it has been since 1980 and it is important, but it is not the driver of space security and national security decisions. And in contrast, as I said, most other nations are very explicit that they want to be on the top edge of cutting edge of new things and new technology. Space is a driver of that, space research and development in particular, and the products, the use of space is much more important than the use of space for many other applications is very important in other countries. And of course, the ESA Convention of 1975 clearly states that one ESA mandate is industrial policy, and that in the US, we tend, in research and development in particular, not to have specific industry policy. Of course, when you spend large amounts of money on space, there is an implicit policy decision, but we're not making explicit policy decisions on that basis. Next slide, please. This is not a space-oriented slide. It is just shows in really obvious terms how U.S. defense spending is about over $700 billion, which, as the title says up there, more than all of the next 10 countries combined. They even include China on there. But as you can see, the two European nations, France and Germany, in purple and light green on the left-hand column, and the UK just below it, even if you want to add that in, is a very small percentage of all defense spending. So in the US, as a percentage of GDP, it's 3.5%. In Europe, about 1.5%. Next slide, please. What does that mean? It means the priorities of the United States spending on defense and space being part of that in many ways, NASA not included there, by the way, is a very strong signal to US industry of markets, of the availability of government funds to purchase defense products from private companies. Plus all of the incentives, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that NASA and other government agencies are building into their systems to stimulate private activity in high-tech industries and, of course, in space. Now, as a footnote, even going back to, in NASA's history, to day one, approximately 80% of NASA's budget, NASA's outlays, its expenditures, have gone to the private sector. What is different today is the way they're contracting, the way they are putting incentives in to give industry even more of a push. But the fact that private companies have built most of the US space assets, from launch vehicles to satellites, is nothing new. Next, please. And as I've said, new space, I don't think is anything really new. First of all, there's nothing new about companies making a profit. That's why they go into business. And again, just re-emphasizing, there's nothing new about private firms being deeply embedded in space activities. Now, some of the incentives that are new are in different ways of contracting with the government, rather than NASA or a government agent saying, please build this to the actual specifications that I'm laying down, that the agency lays down, is different from saying, we want to be able to put a communication satellite in orbit. Build the satellite for us and we'll buy the services. That's more of what they're trying to do now. That coupled with fewer impediments in the regulatory framework, giving licenses out more quickly, being more, working more with industry to stimulate rather than to regulate heavily. And it's an attitudinal change, and it's an important change. But keep in mind that probably, I would say in the last 20 years, space technologies have matured. Many of the things we have up there now, many of the satellites, many of the services are well beyond the research and development stage. We're able to produce them and sell them. The companies are able to. Their companies get new ideas, how to be more productive, more efficient, do something in a different way. And this was not the case when space was a very, very new industry, a new and unexplored area. We have made tremendous gains and improvements, and industry has done this, and now they are able to take some of these ideas and work even further. SpaceX, for example, is no accident. A lot of the people, at least initially, who were hired there had experience with government programs. And of course, one of their major customers is the government. And so they are not a government agency. They are selling to the government. Many of their contracts are performance related to get paid rather than cost plus contracts that are, where a company will earn money, whether they're successful or not quite, but they'll earn money for completing specifications. It is different, but it reflects the growth of the industry and the maturity of the industry. This is true in other nations too, and the opportunities are there. Next slide. Thanks. We have, of course, a lot of official government policy on commercial space. Pages and pages and pages, volumes of it. We have more recent presidential decisions and memos on space generally. Telecom and the spectrum issues are often handled a little bit differently, but they still are integrated into the space policy as well. We have legislation, regulations, I've mentioned that already, and then there are other things too. General antitrust policy, data policy, trade, competitiveness, all these things are important. Space is a global industry. The markets can be global, and we're well aware of that. And of course, we want to be a leader in most in space. We are, but of course now there's a bigger pie. Maybe we're a small percentage of the overall pie, but we're still one of the major investor of any nation in the world. And but with all of those incentives, with all of that maturity, and government programs are quite interesting, because sometimes even other government space policies may interfere and have unintended results with other official state policies, space policies. Next, please. One thing that's important to note also is that the US government has not acted slowly in allowing commercial enterprises to develop capabilities. A lot of enablers have been implemented very fast. I won't read through the whole list here, but even going back to the early days in the 1960s, before we had the treaties, before we had really working systems, it was private sector telecommunications companies that the government supported and encouraged to, from the Echo balloons to the Telstar to Intelsat. It led to the ComSat Act, I believe, that established our relationship with Intelsat, dates back to 1962. In the Reagan years, the deregulation policies in general were applied to aviation and space. We had remote sensing policies in the 90s and licensing and other things. But if you look particularly at the suborbital we had the X Prize won in the early 2000s. Within a year or two, Congress passed an amendment to the Commercial Space Launch Act, enabling the FAA to give out experimental permits. And companies were supposed to fly people to suborbital destinations and tourism, adventure trips, and so on. And by 2008, well, we're now in 2021. They're still saying next year. The point is not that the companies were able to meet their goals, but that the government was allowing them to try it out. In the early 2012, 13, 14, and so on, we had a couple of companies that wanted to mine an asteroid. And they were serious about it. They were raising money and had goals in mind. So by 2015, we had a law in place that it was it was a baby step, but it was an important one because it said to industry, if you are able to obtain resources in space, then you can own them. It didn't say how they would obtain them. It had nothing in there about claims or mining, but it enabled investment in those companies. They didn't make it. We may have other companies doing things as we move ahead in the moon or elsewhere. But the point is, Congress reacted quickly. And we're still in that type of mode to stimulate business. Next slide, please. As I said, there's some inconsistencies because we have partnerships with industries, we've removed regulatory barriers, we've changed government contracting, but we've also still have stringent export control laws and rules, even though recent in the last 5-10 years we've liberalized it a little bit. They're still there. They're going to be there. They're national security oriented. Are they a barrier? Yes, to some things, but not to all things. And the government is willing to work with industry, but they're there. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the last administration, has made that much more active and created some barriers. Again, national security oriented barriers to foreign investments in U.S. companies. And then we've had trade wars, tariffs, immigration problems, visas, now the pandemic. There are a lot of things that will slow down some of this global effort, and also some that affects U.S. companies. Next, please. Then there are unintended effects, even of space policy itself. There's a long history going way back. Europe had the France, Germany, the Symphony, which was a telecom satellite. And to make a long story very short, to get into space, they needed a U.S. launch from a U.S. facility. We weren't allowing it because it could have been competitive with our telecommunications companies. It finally was approved years later as an experimental telecommunications satellite, not an operational one, at least in title. But it woke up, I think, a number of people in Europe to say, well, we need our independent capabilities. They wanted to launch that, and they couldn't. Commercial Ariane was, of course, an early program to do that. It still exists, and it's a very successful launch vehicle. When we built the shuttle, for a number of years, we had a policy that abandoned and zeroed out NASA research and development for the expendable launch vehicle programs. And what did that do? It stimulated competitors abroad to develop more expendable launch vehicles. The shuttle wasn't the answer for everything, but we wanted to put as many satellites on the shuttle as we could to get maximum use out of it. And it aided Ariane. It also aided Russian launch vehicles in the 1990s. It set the US competitively a bit behind. And we had and still have a captive market, prohibition of international competition for US government defense satellites in particular be launched on foreign launch vehicles. And that has an effect on price as well. Our remote sensing policy is very restrictive until just last year. NOAA did not give out many licenses. They were under strict national security parameters. And for example, we never gave a license for a radar satellite to a commercial company in the United States. Now we have plenty, but it set our industry domestically back quite a bit. So the story is a mixed bag of stimulus, but also other policies that inhibited industry in global competition as well. Next, please. So again, to repeat, historically, culturally, U.S. acts quickly. Businesses take risks, they make decisions, and there's, I'd say, they tolerate risk, and the government too. It varies over time. It's not an open book where an open-ended, we'll take life or death decisions or on a company's existence, but we're not too risk adverse, and we have tax incentives as well, but the barriers still exist. So and when I say we're not risk adverse, it varies. Venture capitalists are out there, money is available. Right now, interest rates are low. We see a lot more even overall economic incentives for growth and for long-term investments. As you know, in the past, interest rates have not always been low, and sometimes the push has been just the other way around. Also, more traditional investment companies look at opportunity costs more, which are more for short-run returns. Some of the investment bankers and others are much more conservative than the venture capitalists. They're all out there, they're all working, and we're in an era right now where there seems to be quite a bit of cash around for investment in space and in research and development as well. Next, please. I think it's also important to mention that governments also have different constraints and priorities. The European Space Agency, from the way it's organized from the very beginning, has put in the jus retour, the geographic requirements and limitations. They can't just contract anywhere. They have to return money to the countries that invest, and in a particular proportion that's preset. The European Union, on the other hand, puts out more competitive procurements and doesn't have that same constraint. The United States procurements are competitive, but we have to, within the United States, sometimes political influence determines the geographic distribution of those. As you know, certain states are far more important to the space industry itself than others, particularly the southern tier, Florida, Texas, California, and there are others, but and some of that can be traced to particularly powerful political figures in Congress, and then and some of it to just state lobbying, and there's interstate competition to get these contracts. So it's competitive, but there are always some buts and some ifs as to where things end up with in the United States. Next, please. Can't describe all the tax and fiscal policies in the United States in a couple of minutes that we have here, but What I think is important is the Congress has to pass legislation enabling the spending of money. And there's Congress, first of all, authorizes and then appropriates funds. The executive department then spends the money that Congress gives them. But there's something else in there. And this is the Anti-Deficiency Act. There's nothing new about it. As I said, it goes back to the 1800s. And it essentially prevents the one Congress from requiring obligations of the next Congress. And the new Congress is formed every 2 years, so that it's very hard for the United States government to enter into long-term agreements with other nations. And as I think many of you may recognize and know, that we have many MOUs for joint and cooperative research and development, particularly in the scientific area, NASA, also, and with Europe and with countries in Europe and with other nations. But they're MOUs, memorandum of understandings, rather than a formal treaty-like agreement. Now, that's because NASA can't guarantee that it will have the money in 2 or 3 years from Congress to continue a program, where they're legally constrained to some degree. Other nations will look at these agreements as as a level of a treaty obligation, whereas the United States is looking at it as a budget obligation. So that there are obviously tensions. There are some programs that have been canceled in the middle because the money wasn't there. And of course, it does not create good partnership, a good partnership environment. But it's, as I said, an old constraint that is built into the U.S. system. And of course, just getting a contract through the U.S. government, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR is the acronym, are exceedingly complex and have many social and even competitive provisions built into them. Next, please. I've mentioned both of these earlier, so let's, for purposes of time as well, and being able to get the Q&A later, continue on. Okay, just a few comments from my perspective about space and in Europe. Europe, the EU, really only recently has proposed spending significant money on defense and space. It's an important change, but it is a change. And I think that's, it would take many multiples of these proposals and many years to try to get to the level of the United States in terms of the money spent. And of course, that's a significant market signal that is not in Europe that we have here in the United States. It is a deterrent, really, to some companies and some investment houses from putting money into these programs at a European level. The commercial potential, of course, is out there, but I would argue that in spite of the fact that there are a lot of consumers for telecom services in particular, that in general, the users of space applications are not, and particularly new space applications, are not as robust as government uses of them. Even the PNT, position, navigation, timing, GPS type satellites. In the United States, there's the government, the military owns that system and operates it. They provide a free signal that has become worldwide, that has become the basis of a consumer, large consumer market. And of course, there are other systems, Galileo in Europe and Beidou in China, and other systems out there that are being built that are independent of the United States as GPS, but it is still funded through the defense environment. So there are also limits in the legal area of harmonization, even within the European environment. For example, the Moon Agreement of 1982, which the United States is not party to, but and many European nations aren't either. France signed it, Netherlands, and I think Belgium have ratified it, but not all of the European nations have. Only Luxembourg and Italy have signed the new Artemis Accord. I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. But the fact is that each nation looks at these agreements, treaties separately, so that all nations are not necessarily going to take the same position in Europe. There's no one voice when it comes to abiding by some of these treaty obligations. Licensing also is a national priority, and liability, how much insurance you provide, are also national activities that vary among the nations in Europe. It's maybe still a little too soon to see what the effects on the Brexit and trade space ventures with the UK are. Note that the UK still is a member of the European Space Agency, though, so there will be some coordination. Next, please. A couple of years ago, I was involved with, worked with the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna on a space security study as it reflects on transatlantic cooperation. And this was aimed at the security of assets in space, not using space security for terrestrial purposes. And the next few slides are summaries of some of the findings of that interesting study. And one of the major ones is that data sharing is the backbone. And Europe and the United States also have different approaches to data, big data, privacy, antitrust, and some of the things that will affect and are involved in using space applications, standards being another one. And I think it's important to note that I think Europe has actually been more proactive in looking at the regulations, privacy issues of data, and other things of that sort. I mean, but we still can cooperate. Copernicus, of course, is one example. It's very data intensive, as are other space applications. And getting more agreements on the data policy and on data interacting data standards, so that we can compare and work with Europe, I think is going to be a very important issue as we move ahead. Next, please. And this is too much to read in the short period of time we have, but I think it summarizes quite well the opportunities Europe has and the challenges. And I must say one other thing in working with people at the European Space Policy Institute, when they came to the United States and did interviews with the government, I think they were really, they found more that their eyes were open to what I was saying earlier about the huge focus on national security, which is very different from the focus in Europe. One of the things I want to comment on here is under challenges. The first one, overall deterioration of transatlantic relations at the political level. I hope that this new administration, I expect this new administration to begin to work on that program, on that problem, and at least bring some of the some better feelings to the table than we've had for a few years. But the basic underlying conditions haven't changed, and the challenges are still there, and they are important. Next slide, please. And again, this is a summary of some of the things we've already talked about, some of the strengths in Europe, which I haven't emphasized. There's a long history of cooperation. We have shared concerns, of course. We have agreements in many other areas. This is not necessarily the case with other regions of the world. I think that these are points to build on, and the weaknesses, of course, are there. We've talked about some of them, and will they be changed? Can they be changed? How fast they may change, I think, is the challenge that Europe will face. Next slide, please. I just wanted to look and review very quickly the whole idea of whole issue of international space agreements, not only with Europe, but in general. And I think one of the very optimistic things is, please, the next slide. When we look at the list of negotiated successes on space over the years, this goes way back to the beginning of really 1950, late 1950s, early 1960s, the beginning of really the space age, we see a number of important successes over the years. Where we have asterisks put in there, those are more soft law agreements, none that aren't legally binding, the others are, and it covers all sorts of issues, from the UN treaties to U.S., Russian, Soviet partnerships in Apollo-Soyuz, to commercial endeavors such as Space Data Association, and even to many debris mitigation guidelines. And most recently, the Artemis Accord. Next slide, please. The number of negotiation failures is quite a bit smaller. The upper half of the slide. Moon Agreement was negotiated, but it was never ratified by very many countries, still has not been. The UNIDWA protocol on communication satellites has never gone into effect. The EU Code of Conduct didn't make it. And that may have had more implications for more reasons for failure, were the way it was handled as opposed to what was actually in it. But nonetheless, it didn't. After several tries, it was abandoned. And the Russia-China proposal in the Conference on Disarmament of the Treaty on Prevention and Placement of Weapons in Space has gone nowhere. For various reasons, mainly because there's no way to verify, and it really was not a complete full agreement on weapons in space. It did not include, for example, weapons that might have been launched from terrestrial sources. The two at the bottom, the long-term sustainability guidelines of the UN COPUOS, it failed in 2018, but it did get consensus at the UN level in 2019. We're still talking about implementing, how you implement it. There's still various guidelines that were not approved. I'm not putting that in the failure list, just in one that is ongoing, as is our talks about space traffic management and related issues. If we have time, I'll have some separate comments on that at the end of the talk. Next, please. So what can I look at and say might be some assumptions for and lessons learned for getting to having successful agreements? Well, first of all, I don't think proposals on comprehensive international global governance systems for space are going to happen anytime soon. Also, proposals that list ideals such as space as a global commons can divert discussions from really constructive solutions. Going deeply into that is a long discussion. I know a lot of people will refer to space as a global commons, but when you look at the actual treaties on the space, they talk about common interests and common problems, but not global commons. And I'm not making an argument for anarchy here. I am simply saying that when we talk about space and words like res communis, res nullius are used, in Latin, res means a thing. My point is space is not one thing, it is many different things. It's quite clear that when we get to the moon and China gets there and Russia and maybe Europe and others, we're going to have to learn to live together somehow up there. How we do that is yet to be determined. But because we can't have territorial sovereignty under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, we can't put a flag on the moon and say this is ours. The flag is, but not the land. And other nations aren't supposed to do that either. So how we deal with that is going to be a very tricky issue. But the fact is, we're going to have to find some way of agreeing on a peaceful and good use of the research, and then maybe other developments later on the moon or other areas in space. So that's why I'm saying that this is a non-starter if we say it's global commons, and everything is. We have to be very specific in how we look at that. I do believe, just as with on Earth, economic scarcity, risks, costs, all have to be present before issues can be clearly identified. The issues that we need to agree on, that is, addressed and then resolved. And we still don't know exactly what those issues are. For example, we know there are resources on the moon. Nobody knows what the true value of those is yet. So we're still in an early stage, even though we have the technology that we think will be able to look at these in a engineering, research, mining, use a term you like, it doesn't matter, way. We don't know what the it really is yet. So I believe solutions will likely follow agreements among spacefaring nations. I think we will start with the nations that have the technology to get there. I think we need bi and multilateral agreements. We need to look at common issues, define them well, common problems, and find practical solutions, and use territory analogies that we've used on Earth before, because we are dealing with terrestrial governments. And they are the same governments we're dealing with every day on many different issues. Next, please. So what can we agree on? I think there are quite a few low-hanging fruits here. Let's take the easy things first. Air traffic control is national. We clear airspace for safe launches, re-entry as well. Other nations do the same. Managing, coordinating that may be a problem, but it could be a problem that is more easily solved than things particularly in orbit right now. We're working on the debris issue. Everybody is. I think that we recognize the potential future problems there, and there isn't complete harmony in the way laws and regulations are written, but we're working on it. As an example, of ballistic missiles and launch vehicles, space launch vehicles are included by the way, in that Hague Code of Conduct. I think that is a good start, but if the idea is notifying the world publicly what you're doing to prevent misinterpretations and to prevent misreading of of things that could be read as aggressive actions when they're not really. Space SSA for monitoring conjunction potential, better data, better standards, better sharing. Clearly, not all information will be shared because some of it has military capabilities and military uses, but certainly we need to do enough of that to make space safe. The move and the encouragement the last administration has given to the Commerce Department in the United States to involve commercial companies, and they are responding with more instruments, particularly Earth-based, to monitor space, just as the military is putting more satellites up there to work on this. All are good things, but we need to have coordination, better coordination with all nations that have assets in space. Spectrum management pretty well handled through the ITU and related negotiations. There are new issues that are occurring, but I think that there's a platform there that's well understood by those expert in the telecom and spectrum area, and that will continue. A question mark is how we deal with potential hypersonic vehicles that are working in that gray area between the atmosphere and outer space. ICAO might be the right organization for that part of it, even if they're not expert in outer space affairs. And talked earlier about a lot of incentives. We have not talked about dispute resolution. Treaties leave it to nations to figure out and negotiate solutions. When we have a growth of commercial activities in space and commercial companies, that's not sufficient. What mechanisms, be they commercial arbitration or some other form of dispute resolution in the future, is likely to become an important thing to work on. Next, please. All right, what do I see as not possible? As I mentioned before, I don't see the agreement possibilities in the near term by the major face-paying nations of forming some sort of international alliance on governments and regulations, because all of these will just by definition bump against territorial and sovereignty issues that all nations consider extremely important and guard very carefully. We may be able to agree on norms. I note that the UK in the last year or so at the UN has postulated some norms on behavior in space. I know the US government is looking at those quite seriously and trying to evaluate how we can agree with those, and it's likely we might be able to. It's an optimistic sign. But again, we need enforcement mechanisms, which we don't get out of soft law. And I don't believe that we will be able to have international organizations agreeing on and enforcing the allocation of resources in space, assigning orbits beyond what we've had to do because of the crowding of the geo orbit and the spectrum management through the ITU, and also whether property rights will actually be able to be granted by any organization that would be international in scope on either resource rights or property rights. There may be some compromises in between, but they're going to be very, very difficult to negotiate. Next, please. And then there's the other thing lurking in the background. We mentioned defense expenditures being large, and that is the establishment of the Space Force in the United States. First, I think it's important to recognize that at least initially, The Defense Department was doing a lot of things in space anyway, always has been, and that a lot of the reasons for the Space Force were a reorganization and to make those efforts that were ongoing organized and handled more efficiently, giving more promotion opportunities within one branch of the military, for example, for people working in the space environment. Historically, they've worked 2 years doing something in space and then transfer out for a promotion to another totally different area. And as we all know, space requires particular technical capabilities. And once you've trained, you want to start retraining new people every couple of years. So some of it's been internal situations of that sort. Another is that buying large space satellites is expensive, and acquisition procurement is slow in the military. So they wanted to be able to speed that up, make it more efficient. And you have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all with their own cultures. There was a lot of duplication, is a lot of duplication in the use of space, and not all of it is exactly duplicate. So to try to organize that better and more efficiently was another objective. Of course, when we get to the idea of military and aggressive actions in space, we do run into treaty issues and security situations that will arise in the future, so that we own assets up there. We've always had a policy in the United States of protecting those assets. We have a legal right from the treaties of doing that. How we do it and how other nations act in space, of course, is also behind the Space Force. Next, please. But I took these quotes from actually a brochure that was put out by Space Command in the United States. Some of these might scare you, but they take a very aggressive stand on protecting the U.S. satellites in space and our ability to use them. So I'm just going to let you read these on your own and make whatever conclusions or decisions or comments that you'd like. But the point is that the Space Command is actually taking a very proactive stand on space. And just to read the first sentence of that paragraph, our competitors are not only challenging national security and prosperity in cyberspace. On land, at sea, and in the air, they have turned space, a once peaceful environment, into a warfighting domain. And the last sentence, space is not a sanctuary. Well, I think that may be it is a very strong statement. Perhaps today it is a bit of an overstatement. We do know that other nations have abilities in space that they never had before. Abilities to access and deny and threaten our assets in space. There have been reported incidents even in Europe with European assets. The French, a couple of years ago, for example, were concerned about a Russian vehicle in space near one of their satellites. So far, we haven't had any true well, we've had there have been some incidents, as we know, that have been made public, but we still have the ability to use space. And we hope that we will continue to have that, as will other nations in space. Next, please. So nonetheless, what does warfighting in space really mean? It's vague. And when you actually look at the treaties themselves that all spacefaring nations have agreed to, Weapons are not specifically prohibited in space. Weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, are not permitted to be put into orbit or on a celestial body. Nations did, though, reserve the right to go through space with if you're obviously you wanted to go from one part of the world to another part of the world, and you launched a rocket that was carrying a nuclear warhead or nuclear weapon, it might go into outer space, but that was not prohibited. Although weapons themselves are not prohibited in the treaties, certainly the use of weapons would be a violation of the principle of peaceful uses of outer space, which is one of the very major principles of the Outer Space Treaty. We could go on for a long time trying to define that, but and there are many, many different types of definitions. Nonetheless, the spirit of the treaty is to use space to learn more about the Earth, to learn more about the global environment, and not to fight a war. And I'd also say, parenthetically, space assets could be involved in a war, but wars are between governments. Wars are terrestrial. And so, yes, we have to be concerned about space. I think we also have to be concerned about our relationships here on Earth, because those would be the triggers that might involve space assets in the future. There are new technologies that are being developed that have very powerful commercial and peaceful uses in space, but are also the basis for perhaps other uses as well. RPOs are rendezvous and proximity operations. In other words, one satellite approaching or attaching to another. And the peaceful uses, the good uses of that, are things like refueling, or putting a motor on a defunct rocket so you can boost it to a safe orbit, or re-enter it into space so it won't do damage to another space asset. But of course, when you come close and can attach to another space asset, you have obvious other uses of that too. So we have to be clear. This is one place, for example, where something like a notification system internationally, we're here to do just that, to deorbit the satellite because it poses a danger to all other assets in that area of space, as opposed to, we're approaching your satellite because we want to listen in on your conversations, or some other nefarious reason. We have things like planetary defense, which is trying to protect the Earth from a near-Earth object. It too, the ability to do that has dual use, and virtually almost everything in space could have dual use. And also another trend today is finding that common ground among the major spacefaring nations. We find ourselves going further apart rather than getting closer together. Next, please. Okay, so as I've said before, to possible international agreements, transatlantic agreements, start small, try to get some reasonable agreements now. National laws are extremely important. Implement national laws that are coordinated with other nations, so that we are not, we work in harmony. Develop soft law. That seems to be the route today. New treaties are unlikely, could take 20 years or more to negotiate. We don't have the luxury of that. So let's start where we can And then with soft law, perhaps, again, going back to the role of nations to add to their space laws standards and norms based on international agreements. Invite all nations to join those agreements. Work with the UN COPUOS, not against it. And it's a great place for discussion, and it can help to stimulate and speed up the process. And then also in the background, work on consensus on issues that seem to be impossible today, but that we need to work on tomorrow for tomorrow. Next, please. Just a few comments. The Artemis Accords I put in here, excuse me, because it is a start at something of that sort. Yes, it came out of the NASA program, the Gateway and Artemis programs to go to the moon. Note that only 2 European nations so far have signed, but ESA signed a separate agreement with NASA on Gateway, on the cooperation on the Gateway program. And ESA is, the Artemis Accords is for nations to sign. ESA, of course, is not a nation in and of itself. So it's quite appropriate they didn't sign it at this point. Most of the Artemis Accords take principles directly from the Outer Space Treaty. In other words, there's nothing new there. Peaceful exploration, transparency, use the registration convention, disseminate scientific data, and so deconflict the different activities. All those things are written into the treaty that's over 50 years old, and that all spacefaring nations have agreed to. What's new in the Artemis Accord are looking at space resources as a key way of exploration. I think that's true. How we do and how we get resources is not described there. Preserving historic sites on the heritage sites on the moon has been something that has been talked about for many years. It's akin to the UNESCO common heritage sites, but of course all of those are on countries and under sovereign control. The moon is not under sovereign control. So just saying we're not going to destroy your sites, and please other nations don't destroy ours, I think is something that's worth doing, and really at low cost, and probably won't interfere with exploration much at all. Interoperability, having nations cooperate, work together on the Gateway and moon programs can be very important, because and it also helps develop common standards and usage up in space. We deal with orbital debris, due regard, prevent harmful interference, all very good. There's another issue not talked about in the Accords, and that might be perhaps debris, things we leave on the moon, how we deal with that, but at least there's a beginning of a discussion here. Expanding the rescue and return agreement and providing emergency assistance is a good goal. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. The last one on here, what's new, is proposing safety zones for when we're actually on the moon, is a beginning of a suggestion of what I was referring to before, of finding common ways of working on the moon together. How we do that, the details are not in these accords, but the idea of trying to do that is there, which is, I think, a useful thing. Note that the Artemis Accord is not legally binding. It is a soft law. It only applies to civil government activities, not to any other activities governments might have, ideas governments might have in other worlds. And it doesn't specify very much about the private sector and private entities other than recognize that they are going to be part of the program, but exactly how the governments will oversee and regulate industry is not addressed in those accords. Next, please. So just to summarize a comparison of Europe and the United States, the funds available for government contracts, especially military and intelligence missions, are quite different. The size and the number of large United States companies is also much greater. Those two are, of course, closely connected. The ability of the US to act more quickly than Europe, I think, is an important difference. Having the billionaires, the angel investors, the Musks and Bezos, and Branson's actually British, but most of his operations are being carried out in the United States. I think having those entrepreneurs has been a particularly interesting and good stimulus for the private sector. One other thing I didn't mention, the US system of contracting and working between the government and industry has always been one of contracts with that sometimes can get adversarial. Sometimes companies sue the government, the other way around as well. They're arm's length transactions for the most part. It is very rare that the US government owns equity shares in any company. It's happened occasionally and for short periods of time when a company that's important for national security or to the economy is threatened with bankruptcy and the government has taken it over briefly. But we don't, government employees do not serve on boards of directors of companies, and companies and government does not own equity shares. I believe those situations are a bit different in Europe. It's more of a back and forth cooperative arrangement, and there's than it is the contract adversarial, possible adversarial environment. Of course, it's important for companies and our government to cooperate and not be adversarial, and for most part they do, but there are these options available within our system. Next, please. I'll end with a few comments on the new administration, on Biden's space. First of all, as I mentioned before, for the time being, status quo. Space Force will continue. The Gateway Artemis program will continue. Mars exploration certainly is going on. The success of the Ingenuity helicopter, I read it had second flight just yesterday, and other research, it's very impressive. Deep space exploration as well will continue. We'll have some more domestic regulatory reform. The question will be how it is done, who will do it, how aggressively we'll proceed. We don't know the answers to that yet. We do know, of course, that the political appointees from the past administration have left, as would be expected. We'll have new people to work with. I suspect that most of what was the trends that have been announced from past administrations will continue, but there may be some significant differences. We see in the budget proposals that this administration is going to put more money into some of the space agencies, and certainly they will be engaged more in international organizations. Next, please. As of today, as mentioned, that no major changes have been announced. Biden seems very interested in space. The Office of Science and Technology Policy in the executive branch has now been upgraded to cabinet status. So with the National Space Council continuing the upgrade of OSTP, I think that science and space being part of that, even though maybe the focus initially is going to be on health and COVID and on some other issues, climate as well. Space will have a significant role. The role of the vice president has not been talked about at all, but the announcement of former Senator Bill Nelson is a very strong advocate of space, and I think he went through his hearing this week quite easily. He'll be appointed as administrator. I suspect the same easy way through Congress with Pam Melroy as deputy. She's a former astronaut, been a commander of the shuttle flights, has held positions in a regulatory environment and also in Defense Advanced Research and Planning Administration, and is an old hand at space policy. And the other thing to note is that getting people into NASA at high levels is now being done much earlier in this administration than many prior ones. So again, another sign that space is important to the Biden administration. Next, please. What changes can we expect? I think it's clear that we're not going to have any lids or caps put on the findings of science research, that we'll have more open dissemination of information, at least about scientific things, than we perhaps had in the past. Clearly, climate's important. Earth observations as part of that will be important. NASA, will probably get more money and more things will be shifted to looking at climate. And again, the success of Kerry so far in the last week or two is at least encouraging on that note. And that even though Gateway and Artemis are going to continue, the 2024 hard deadline of getting people up there will still be a goal, but not a deadline. And I believe that safety and having enough money to get there safely and bring people back and do what they're planning on doing will take more time. And I believe this that Congress will give them more money for the project, probably not enough to fund it by 2024. So I think it's going to move forward, but with those caveats. And frankly, Congress wasn't giving the past administration enough money to get there by 2024 anyway. Next slide. And this, I don't think, needs repeating, but we know that internationally, not just US and Europe, but the US relationship with China, Russia in particular, but also Europe's relationship with China and Russia are going to be very important as we move ahead. We have the International Space Station Partnership. That how long will the station continue? What will happen next? China's putting up its own space station, and I think these are going to be interesting developments to follow, and how they're carried out. What happens there is going to say a lot about U.S. and Europe relationships. I think there will be a push for closer relationships to counterbalance some of what's happening elsewhere in the world. I also see US and Japan having closer relationships for many of the same reasons, and sharing more information and more security operations. Next, please.
Sorry, Henry, do you want to completely?
No, I was going to say maybe we should have a questions and answers.
Okay.
If there are none, we could go through the next set of slides. But
so I can bypass all those, even the space situational awareness slide and so on, or?
Well, you wanted me to define this a little bit better. I'd be glad to. There are acronyms that we use: SSA, SDA, STM, space traffic management, one of the points I was going to make is that the definitions are very unclear. The definition covers almost everything, including some of these topics, so that it's very hard to focus right now on what is meant. The U.S. is changing its use of the previously of the terms. We're using space situational awareness, SSA. I believe there's an official change to calling it SDA, domain awareness. The easiest way to explain that is situational awareness is, for example, driving your car and using your GPS to know where you are geographically, where you are on the highway. Domain awareness is that plus looking at everything around you, what's above, what's the potholes in the street, cars coming from the side, what's in front of you, what's behind you. And it is a much more data-intensive, comprehensive view of where you are and how you can react and stay safe and drive your car with more knowledge of what every driver has to do anyway when they're paying attention to the road. Debris mitigation has many aspects too, and from active debris just in time, conjunction analysis, all sorts of things. And in fact, maybe go to the last slide on my presentation for 1 second. I think that's worth putting up. Yeah, that one. Just in January, it's a product of the last administration, but it's not really a political document. They went to all the agencies in the US government and looked at what needs to be done in terms of solving or addressing the debris issue. And what came out of it, it's a short study, it is worth looking at. It's US centric, but I think it's applicable almost everywhere. They separated debris into, I think, about 10 or 11 categories in that table below. Many of them are terrestrial, such as improving manufacturing so that satellites don't conk out in space. But it also includes legal and economic studies of the debris issue in there. So it's not all just going up there and capturing satellites and cleaning up space. It is all the issues that we need to deal with. And what comes out of this report is that even though we've been talking about debris mitigation for 25 years, there's still a lot of research and development that has to be done. We don't know how to do all these things yet. And then what's on the right in the columns there are tasks that different agencies in the US can undertake to do this. But it is also clear in the report that international cooperation and partnerships are very important in engaging in these partnerships to solve these R&D problems, let alone operational problems. Okay, I'm going to end there.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. It was really very interesting. We have, of course, a lot of questions because it was really rich. I would say we start maybe first with a topic that is raising a lot of concern, which is the rise of satellite constellations and how this will affect equitable access to space, in your opinion, especially because so far the main initiatives are coming from the US private market. Do you want to go one by one, or do you want to collect some of them?
Let's do, you choose some for me, and I think okay. I don't even see my screen here. I think the easy answer to that is that we don't know. First of all, we don't know how many constellations there may be. There are a lot of proposals out there for thousands and thousands of satellites. We know that SpaceX and Starlink has a lot up there. OneWeb will put a lot up there. What's the eventual market? Is there really a market for many of these constellations? On the legal side, we have the Outer Space Treaty actually ensures the freedom of access to space without discrimination. Now, putting a lot of things in one particular orbit is a sort of a de facto, yeah, it's crowded. But low Earth orbit has not yet come under the same crowded and potentially valuable, the same conditions of geo-orbit, where you have only a limited number of spaces over very populated areas, and we've had to internationally find a way to allocate that. This is all new in LEO, so we haven't yet addressed that issue nationally or internationally. I could see the possibility of that happening, but at this point, I don't have an answer to that question. The treaties are open-ended, and yet we're going to have those economic realities appear in the future, but I've seen no discussion about that yet.
Thank you very much. The second question relates actually to what we were discussing right before starting our webinar. And what emerges from all EU space policy documents seems to be the will to become independent from the US and to gain a leading role worldwide, such as the role of the US in the past 70 years. However, in the new space regulation, as we were in fact discussing, that will enter into force at some point, the cooperation with the US is stressed and it is enhanced. And the US is here not only mentioned as a proper partner for space programs and activities, but as also was made in more recent policy documents as the natural partner, as you rightly mentioned before. In this regard, do you see a change in the EU space policy in the sense of cooperation, especially considering that some of the commentators, some of the doctrine argued that so far the European Union built very much its space engagement through this competition with the US, this need to reach autonomy and so on.
Very, very hard to answer that. I don't see, I think both the US and Europe engage in the captive market idea. Arianespace, yes, it's commercial. It will launch certain US private satellites. It can't compete for government satellites, which has always bothered, I know, the Europe. If we're talking launch vehicles, frankly, internationally, there's an oversupply, and we're trying to build more. So it's certainly not optimal from any global economic perspective. And I think we're also much closer to the day when, if you have money in your wallet and you want to buy a launch, you can buy a launch, assuming it's safe, peaceful, but some of the very basic considerations for commercial sector. But it's also going to be interesting to see how, let me put it this way. One of the reasons that the United Launch Alliance with the Atlas and Delta launchers has been so successful is that the US government has put a lot of money over time in developing reliable rockets because they want assured access to space. Commercial launches may or may not meet that test. When you look at history of most launch vehicles, or of all launch vehicles together, there's a high failure rate. It's 5-6%. But with Atlas and Delta, the heavy lift U.S. launches, they haven't had accidents. They've had well over 100 successful launches in a row. That's quite a record. It costs money. It's expensive to do that. SpaceX is proving itself reliable today. They started with had some setbacks and accidents. We'll see how they continue, but you know, they've proven that that they can launch successfully military rockets, military spacecraft. So many of the new developing launch companies, other than Blue Origin, are looking at small vehicles for these small satellites. Their success record their future success record is unknown. So you know, I think a lot of this will come down to risk and cost in the long run. So, but as I mentioned, we still have the export control issues. If you want to launch a spacecraft that has an instrument on it that's controlled by export control, it's going to cost you a lot more if you get a license from abroad, and you'll have to get a approval from our State Department, and possibly have to have other security measures built into it. So I think cooperation is possible there. What I question is whether independent access is really something that's worthwhile anymore. Let's say you don't have Ariane in Europe, just to say that, let's say it didn't exist. You could go to India, you could go to Japan, you could go elsewhere and buy a launch. Whether you could get it launched at the time on the manifest and the way you want to get it launched is another issue. And I know that Europe has export control rules as well. US is not the only one with these rules. So it's going to be tricky. But look, when we wanted to discourage the Russians from providing technology to China, Iran, and so on back in the 1990s, we allowed them to launch some military rockets, not the most sensitive ones, but some military satellites. I mean, so you know, we had a different national security reason for allowing that. So that I think that a lot of things can be put on the table. Whether they will or not, I'm not predicting, but they certainly could be. Of course. One other, I think, important comment: space. It's a lot of visibility, credible amount of visibility in the world for the relatively small amount of money compared to national budgets, defense budgets that goes into it. And so it has often also become part of a political chit in negotiations in many, many different ways. So that we can't look at it just from an economic or just from one aspect of national security. It's part of a much larger package.
Of course. We have another question. In your presentation, you mentioned among the challenges the different diplomatic sensitivities among the two countries, and some of the attendees would like to know why, to elaborate a bit more, why this is a problem in cooperation between the two states, the two space powers.
Well, anytime there are differences, they have to be worked out. And you know, the politics in both places can change very rapidly, and you have to accommodate it. I mean, without getting into specific political differences, I think that just in general, socially, politically, and economically, you know, even within Europe, the 27 nations are not the same. and let alone with the United States. And you look U.S. relationships with France are different from those with Italy, or so that I think and governments change anyway over time. So they all have to be, they're all part of the equation.
You mentioned before, as regards to STM, since we couldn't present that part, that of course at the moment there is not a shared vision, both in terms of definition, in terms of regulation, and so on. However, of course, every space power is developing somehow its concept of STM. The US is doing so, the European Union is doing so, China is doing so, and so on. At the end, there is the risk that we will have different perception of the same phenomenon, and it will be even more difficult to reconcile the different elaborations and come to common rules of the road. What do you think would be a good way of coming from one of the different space powers to try already in this initial, let's say, engagement to prevent this from happening, and to have in the end a lot of different solutions that might become incompatible one with the other?
First, let's assume that we don't have a big accident while we're talking, because that could change the whole environment very quickly. We've been lucky for many years that we haven't had the big one, and let's hope that luck continues. I mean, when you look at some of the European-led studies, they are much more of a top-down approach than a bottom-up. And so, that's obviously a result of civil law compared to common law, that, you've been brought up in Europe a different way than we have here. I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong. The end result is sort of in the middle and somewhat similar, but the approach is different. So that has to be understood. And, when I was saying in my talk, for example, that the top-down approach, that international governance, some organization to make rules and enforce them, is not going to really work in this case, at least not today. That whole different philosophical approach to law, I think, is very important in the thinking and understanding those differences. So even if the end result ends up fairly similar, we have to begin with some sort of compromise on how we can come to an agreement. Every nation too has different assets in space, and how do you pay for all of this? Whose responsibility is it? I mean, it's most of the junk up there is Chinese, Russian, or US. The exact proportion, I don't know, I don't remember, but there's a lot of stuff up there. And so should those nations that put a lot of stuff up there pay more or not?
The sort of the negative externalities in the end, it's what we would.
And clearly we're all in the same boat. And if all of our satellites are equally threatened, that has to be part of this formula. And space is expensive. Trying to do something up there is very expensive. Can we live with what we have now in debris up there and just put more stringent regulations on what gets launched and how we deal with new potential debris, which we're trying to do in some ways, but it costs money. And there's, as we said, we're still in an R&D stage. We still don't know what the total costs or what all the methods might be. So, that's why I said in the talk, we need to actually realize what we're talking about in cleaning up there. Are we talking about just getting rid of the 50 largest things that might blow up or become part of an accident? Or are we talking about all the little stuff as well? That's still on the table. The experts say clean up the big things and we'll be okay. Maybe we will. I don't know.
Of course. Then I have another question about from also the audience on what you mentioned before and on the fact that currently the old administration at least took a very quite aggressive and proactive stand towards space. However, the interpretation also of some concepts of international law will affect the future relations between states. Because as we know, for instance, as regards to the use of force, some scholars and of course some governments who adhere more to those type of scholarship tend to put the threshold somewhere, while other more European scholars maybe tend to put this threshold somewhere else. So implicitly, when we open the floor to the fact that space is a warfighting domain, which is something that is not so new also in the words of NATO, actually it's quite a direct consequences of the trends that we had in the past years. But these problems, which in the end regard interpretation of also of international law, will come into place at some point, and there it will be crucial to address them in advance. How do you see these? How could we prevent this from happening, and what could be the right fora where to push for at least some common views and understandings in this regard?
A tough question. You're asking big questions for which there are no real answers. I'll just comment that there are some groups looking at those problems right now internationally as to how you interpret some of the military aspects of space and the warfighting. There's no manual on this. As you correctly said, there are a lot of different interpretations. The UN Charter is involved, the Article 51 on what is, on self-defense. What is that in space? Whether there has to be an attack, and then you can respond necessary and proportionally, or whether you anticipate something and what's involved there. There's no agreement on that. There probably won't be. There hasn't been for years, even in other aspects of military action on the seas and the air. So trying to predict that for space may be incident related more than anything else. But I mean, it's important, and that we have international dialogue on the topic. That is going on. There's a project called Millamos and some others, and at least to begin to address these issues. But resolving them is not something that I certainly could comment on in 30 seconds, and wouldn't want to, because it's a very complex issue. Whether we're talking about activities in space, whether we're talking about activities from Earth to space, or whether we're talking about activities in the electromagnetic spectrum and cyberspace, are all handled differently and have different connotations. So I mean, we're well aware of all this, and that's not the only part of the treaties that may need interpretation, shall we say, but we don't have real customary international law because we have very few court opinions on space activities right now. That's something that might happen in the future. Whether environmental issues are a precedent for space is another long discussion, and has been written about, but without real agreement on how you interpret state responsibility, state liability as well, and getting into very complex, very simple ideas, but very complex in actual negotiations and in carrying them out. So I think I think the question is accurate. I think it's a good one, but it's not one I can answer. Anybody can reasonably give a quick answer to.
Okay, it's actually 6 p.m. So our time is over. Do you want to take another extra question? Do you have time for it, or otherwise we can just close
It's a
this?
short one that's answerable.
No, I think it's answerable. So one of the attendees asked, what is your opinion about the establishment of safety zones, since it could actually lead to a de facto appropriation, which might, of course, be against the Outer Space Treaty provisions? And if you could perhaps clarify.
We have the precedent in the geolocations to avoid spectrum interference. They are not unlimited allocations. They are limited and to very specific things. I think that it will be possible to have limited property rights in space, but not ownership. We do it in Antarctica. We can have a protection zone around a scientific facility. The idea of free and open access with notification and approval first is possible. I mean, I think there are a lot of possibilities. I think, but it will be necessary to have something like that eventually. So.
Thank you. I promise it was an easy one to answer. This one.
It was, well, fairly easy.
Fairly.
Yeah. Good.
So
okay. Oops. Yeah.
Our time is over. Before closing the webinar, let me once again remind you to check our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence website. Is spacegovernance.eu. You could register for the next upcoming lectures. Next week we will have Professor Hoffman on national space law, and then we will have Peter Martinez, Director Martinez, in a conversation with Director Simonetta Di Pippo on the long-term sustainability guidelines. Please send us emails if you want any information or material to be distributed. And finally, I would really like to thank you for this excellent lecture. It was really very rich. We covered so many topics, so actually the questions were way more than the one we could ask. And we hope to host you again in person, perhaps next year when the times allows.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you. Good.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye to everyone.